Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. It's really great to be here back in New Jersey, where gravity works most of the time, where I can breathe oxygen at will, and where it would appear that most of you are not space aliens. But to the rest of you, let me just say, I come in peace. You know, Bono and I have something in common. My wife, Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, is in love with both of us. You see, a couple weeks before Gabby and I were to get married, she sat me down and she said, "You know, Mark, I've been looking for the right person for a long time. And I'm pretty sure that's you. But I need to tell you something." And then she sat me down and she explained to me that there was somebody else. And then she told me that that person was Bono. Well, a couple months after Gabby was injured and recovering in a hospital in Houston, Texas, I get a call on my cell phone, and the guy on the other end of the phone says, "Mark, this is Bono." And I said, "Bono who?" Said, "It's just Bono." And they proceeded to tell me how he had felt like he'd met my wife Gabby before. He saw what happened to her in Tucson, getting shot in Tucson. He saw all this stuff on TV, and he had a really strong feeling that he may have met her when he visited with members of Congress on Capitol Hill. So Bono told me that he went back and he took a look at all the pictures he'd taken with members of Congress, and he found the picture of him and Gabby. And then Bono told me that he now kept that picture on his desk at home. And I said, "Huh. What a coincidence. It's the same picture that Gabby has on her desk. There's no picture of me and Gabby. There wasn't even Gabby and any president, just Gabby and Bono sitting on her desk." So needless to say, I did not invite him to come visit her in the hospital. You know, like many of you in this room, I came from a very ordinary background. I grew up not 10 miles from here, right down the road in West Orange, New Jersey, where go West Orange, where my dad was a stereotypical, tough New Jersey, Irish detective kind of guy, and my mom was usually, when I was younger, was a secretary and a waitress pretty much at the same time. And while I was in middle school, she decided that she wanted to become a police officer like my dad. And this was like in the 1970s. And for a woman to become a cop, it's a really difficult thing to do, and my mom had to pass a test, and part of this test was a physical fitness test that required she climb over this 7-foot 2-inch wall. Now my mother was all of about 4 feet 13 inches tall. And to help my mother out, my dad built a replica of this thing in our backyard. He didn't tell her he made it an inch higher at 7'3". And I'd watch my mom go out there after dinner every night and try to get over this thing. Initially, she couldn't even reach the top. And when she finally could, she would just fall off into the dirt. But after months and months of practicing, when she finally took this test, instead of getting over in the required 9 seconds, she got over in 4.5. It's much faster than almost all the men. And she became one of the first female police officers in this part of northern New Jersey. Well, this is the first time in my life that I saw the power of having a goal and a plan and what it meant to work really, really hard at something. And it really motivated me. And I started working harder myself. I certainly started getting better grades. I went out there and got a couple jobs along the way, even when I was in middle school and then in high school. And pretty much for my entire time in high school, even through college, the job I had was as an EMT driving an ambulance in Orange, East Orange, and Newark. Right here, some pretty tough neighborhoods, especially in the 1980s. And one of the last patients that I ever dealt with was a young guy picked up off the sidewalk in Newark in about 1985 who had 7 bullet holes in him. And one of those was a gunshot wound to the head. And the experience with that young guy on that sidewalk in Newark would come back as a very real and immediate part of my life as I first learned the extent of my wife Gabby's injuries. Now, unlike me, my wife Gabby, she was your classic overachiever. She grew up in Tucson, Arizona, where she went to the school for the gifted and talented kids. Now, I hated those kids. But when I met my wife on this trip to China, she seemed like 10 women at once to me. She was a state senator. She was a CEO of her family's business. She'd gone to an Ivy League school. She was a Fulbright scholar. She even raced motorcycles. And like my mom, I could tell that Gabby was a woman that had some serious goals and would work really, really hard to achieve them. And one of Gabby's goals was, if ever given the opportunity, she really wanted to serve her community as a member of Congress. Well, I had some lofty goals myself. Even before I graduated from Mountain High School in West Orange, New Jersey, I decided that I wanted to be the first person to walk on the planet Mars. I believed if I worked hard enough and took the right steps and maybe got lucky along the way, I'd make it to Mars someday. Well, I left NASA several years ago without ever getting to Mars, but I did get kind of close. I made it into space 4 times. Now, if any of you think that's impressive, getting into space 4 times, just think of how impressed the aliens were when I told them that I have visited the planet Earth 5 times. They were really impressed. But to get there, I'd have a plan, and my plan was to become a naval aviator, and then a Navy test pilot, and then an astronaut. Maybe I'd make it to Mars someday. Well, I graduated from college in 1986, and I headed off to flight school at the Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida. Navy guy. Does anybody in here remember what movie came out in 1986? Top Gun. Kind of embarrassed to tell you this, but since I'm here in New Jersey, I'll tell you anyway. So literally, as I'm driving through the gate of the Naval Air Station for the very first time, I have that cheesy music from the movie playing on the tape deck of my car. I think it was the Danger Zone song. And then I get there, and I start flying for the Navy, and I very quickly find out that I am not Maverick. I'm like not a very good pilot. Like I really stunk for a long period of time. You know what the Navy does to you after about a year in flight school? They send you to land on a ship for the first time. Now, I could barely land on a runway. And when the Navy sends you to land on an aircraft carrier for the very first time, there is not anybody that is crazy enough to go with you. So you go all by yourself, empty back seat of this airplane. I remember taking off out of the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Florida, out to what felt like the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Now, they put the ship about 50 miles offshore to make sure you could find it. You fly overhead this ship, and you look down the landing area. It looks like a little postage stamp bobbing in the ocean, and you turn downwind. Initially, I'm going to do what's called a touch-and-go landing, where I touch the deck, I take off again. So I did that twice. Third time around, I also put the tail hook down, and that hook is supposed to grab one of the 4 wires strung across the back of the ship. Well, it didn't. I completely missed all the wires. I almost missed the ship. When I come around a 4th time, I land generally in the right place, and the hook grabs the wire. And when it does that, it's like getting in a car accident. It's like crashing in your car. You go from 150 knots to nothing in about 150 feet. And you pull back the power, you raise the hook, you go to this catapult, you get shot off the front of the ship. I barely remember any of this. I go through this 3 more times. Eventually, I get sent back to the Naval Air Station, and then later that evening, I'm getting debriefed by the instructor pilot who was watching from the back of the ship, the guy giving me my grades. You know the first thing this guy says to me is? He says, "Are you sure this career is for you?" He says, "You did not do well at all." And I'd be the first to admit how poorly I did. In fact, I think Tom Cruise would have been better at that than me. And I don't mean the character from the movie, I mean the actor. Tom Cruise probably would have been better at landing on the ship than I was. But you know what? I didn't give up. And the guys that did really well that day did not go on to become test pilots or astronauts. I know this because I often see them at the front on Southwest Airlines. I'm just kidding. I actually never see anybody I know up there. And remember, I said they were the good pilots. We know that from last week, right? They were the good pilots. But I really believe this, and this always applied to me, and it might apply to some of you, especially some of you scouts out there. I mean, think about this, that how good you are at the beginning of anything you try is not a good indicator of how good you can become, right? I am a prime example of somebody who was able to overcome a serious lack of aptitude for something with just practice, persistence, and basically just not giving up. It's actually really the only thing that ever worked really well for me. You know, I think for all of us, life is a set of challenges, whether they're personal or professional challenges. And one of my other early professional challenges happened in the summer of 1990 when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. I was a pilot of an airplane called the A-6 Intruder, which is a two-person, all-weather ground attack airplane. I was stationed in Japan aboard the aircraft carrier, the USS Midway, and by the fall of that year, we were heading down through the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean, up into the Persian Gulf. We got there around Thanksgiving, and on January 17th of 1991, it was time for me to fly my first combat mission. Now, this airplane I flew was a two-person airplane where I was the pilot, and I have another guy, and the other guy was my bombardier navigator, and my bombardier navigator was a guy named Paul Fujimura, and Paul was a graduate of the University of California at Berkeley. I think he's perhaps the only person from Berkeley ever to go in the military. But he was a good guy. He was good at his job, and Paul and I, we went up to the flight deck early that night. We did not want to be late for our first combat mission. We get up there, it's really dark out. There's these guys in red shirts loading bombs and missiles onto all the airplanes, ours included. We were carrying, I think, 8 1,000-pound bombs that night to drop on a hangar, maintenance hangar, at a place called Shaiba Airfield in the city of Basra in southern Iraq. And Paul and I, we hop into the airplane, we turn on the batteries, avionics, radios, and it just doesn't take long for us to hear of another A-6 Intruder just like ours just get shot down. And now they're looking for the air crew. A little while later, we start the engines, go to the catapult, we're shot off the front of the ship. We fly a couple hours north. We go to this airborne fuel tanker and take on a full load of gas, and then proceed further north towards the southern coast of Iraq in the northern part of the Persian Gulf. And as soon as we get over land, we could see anti-aircraft artillery, AAA, bullets coming up from the ground at us. And at night, you can see the tracers. And as the Iraqis on the ground would move these guns back and forth, it looks like a bunch of snakes coming up through the sky at you. Now, Winston Churchill said about his own personal experience in combat, he said, "There's nothing more exciting than being shot at and missed." Well, speaking from experience, the missed part's kind of important. And to get to our target that night, we had to go through this area in southern Iraq that had a really big air defense system. The Iraqis bought a lot of surface-to-air missiles from the Soviet Union and later from Russia. And to get to our target, we had to go right through the middle of these missile envelopes. And after we made this left-hand turn, most of these missile batteries were to our south, to my left, so I kept looking over my left shoulder. I got to tell you, the worst feeling I've ever had in my life was seeing that missile come up at our airplane, big, bright, white dot, just getting bigger, not moving forward or aft in the canopy, just staying in the same place relative to us. If it does that, you know what that means? It's coming right at you. And as soon as I see this thing, I immediately say to Paul, I said, "Hey, I think we have a missile coming at us." Now, his only response to me is he says, "Roger, I'm tracking the target." meaning the hangar. So he's looking at these two screens, a radar screen, an infrared screen. He's got his hand on this joystick. He says, Roger, I'm tracking the target. A little while later, I say, Paul, did you hear me? This thing's still coming right at us. And again, his only response, very calmly, Roger, I'm tracking the target. Now, he's doing what we call in the Navy or at NASA, compartmentalization, which is focusing on the stuff that he has some influence over and not worrying about the stuff outside of his control. That missile, that's my problem. I know in your lives, in business, whatever career you might be in, there's often incredible distractions out there. It might be the economy, it might be government regulation, it might be just shenanigans in Washington, D.C. A lot of distractions out there, and sometimes all any of us can do to do our jobs really well is to try to figure out what's the important stuff to focus on and try to pay attention to that. So a little while later, I say to Paul, I'm like, hey, I'm going to have to do a last-ditch maneuver. This thing's about to hit us. He doesn't say anything. I add full power. I roll the airplane upside down. I put the stick in my lap. We go down. Missile goes over the top and explodes. There's a big flash. The airplane shakes. I get the airplane turned up